The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Eleanor Ellie Cartwright as she stumbled through the sagebrush, her once fine traveling dress now torn and dust-covered. The fabric, once a deep navy blue with delicate white piping, her Sunday best, hung in tatters around her ankles. Her bonnet, long since abandoned, had left her face exposed to the brutal Nevada sun, which had burned her fair skin to an angry red. At 58, she had survived the Civil War, buried 2 husbands, and raised 4 children who scattered to the winds. But nothing had prepared her for this, abandoned in the Nevada wasteland by a man who'd promised her a partnership in a Silver Creek boarding house. Too old and worn out, Jake Morrison had sneered before riding off with her life savings. His handsome face had twisted into something ugly as he looked down at her from his horse. "Thought you might still have some fire left, but you're nothing but ashes now, woman." The memory of his words stung worse than the sun on her blistered skin. The $342.17 she'd saved over 15 years of widowhood, pennies pinched from mending clothes, selling preserves, and taking in washing, was gone, along with her dignity and her last desperate hope for companionship in her twilight years. The buzzards circled overhead, black silhouettes against the merciless blue sky, as Ellie's legs finally gave out near a dried creek bed. The ground beneath her was cracked and parched, much like her lips, which had split and begun to bleed hours ago. Her vision blurred, the landscape wavering like a mirage, and she prepared to meet her maker in this god-forsaken place. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived childbirth 4 times, nursed soldiers through typhoid during the war, and weathered the loss of 2 husbands, only to die alone in the dirt because she'd been fool enough to trust a man with kind eyes and empty promises. That's when she heard the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked, the sound cutting through her delirium with startling clarity. "Well, I'll be damned," came a gravelly voice, rough as sandpaper on wood. "What's a lady doing dying in my backyard?" Ellie squinted up at a weathered man in his 60s, his gray beard stained with tobacco juice, a battered hat shading eyes that had seen too much. Deep creases fanned from those eyes, carved by decades of squinting into the sun. His clothes were patched and faded, but clean in a way that spoke of self-respect, despite circumstances. This was Rattlesnake Pete Donovan, though she wouldn't learn his name until later. "Ain't much of a lady anymore," she croaked, her voice barely audible through her parched throat. She tried to sit up, a final gesture of dignity, but her arms trembled and gave way. Pete studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who'd survived 3 decades on the frontier. His eyes, a startling blue against his leathery skin, took in her condition with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen death approach in many forms. "Maybe not, but you ain't dead yet neither. That counts for something out here." He shifted his rifle to one hand and extended the other, calloused and strong. "Can you stand, or am I gonna have to carry you?" Ellie tried again to rise, pride warring with weakness. "I can manage," she whispered, though her body betrayed her words. Pete snorted, a sound somewhere between amusement and resignation. "Sure you can, and I'm the King of England." Without further discussion, he hauled her onto his mule and took her to his ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of Deadwood Gulch, a mining town so rough that decent folks crossed themselves when mentioning its name. The cabin came into view as they crested a small rise. A humble structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side. A thin wisp of smoke suggested a banked fire within. Around the cabin, Pete had carved out a semblance of order from the wilderness. A small vegetable garden, protected from rabbits by a fence of scavenged wood. A lean-to shelter for the mule, and a workbench under an awning where tools hung in neat rows. For 3 days, Ellie drifted between fever dreams and consciousness, while Pete spooned broth between her lips and muttered about damn fool women coming west. In her lucid moments, she noticed how he moved around the cabin, with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. His hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were surprisingly gentle as he tended to her sunburns with a salve that smelled of pine and something medicinal. When she finally sat up, clear-headed, Pete was cleaning his rifle at a scarred wooden table. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The interior was sparse but orderly, a far cry from the chaos of her journey. You got a name? Or should I keep calling you that stubborn woman who won't die? Pete asked without looking up from his task. His fingers moved with practiced precision over the weapon's parts. Eleanor Cartwright. And I suppose I owe you my life. She smoothed her hands over the rough blanket covering her legs, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Don't owe me nothing, Pete grunted, setting aside his cleaning cloth. But you can't stay here. This ain't no place for a respectable woman. He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable beneath his bushy eyebrows. Ellie looked around the one-room cabin with its dirt floor and single window. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner, while a narrow cot, presumably where Pete had been sleeping while she occupied his bed, was tucked against the opposite wall. Respectable women don't get abandoned in the desert, Mr. Donovan, Pete Donovan. He hesitated, then added, Some folks call me Rattlesnake, on account of a disagreement I had with a nest of them some years back. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a forearm mottled with scars. I won, eventually. Ellie nodded, accepting this introduction without comment. And what's your story? You run off with some smooth-talking snake oil salesman? Pete asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. The whole sorry tale spilled out, the loneliness after her children left, married to California with her merchant husband, Thomas to the railroads in the east, Sarah to a teaching position in Chicago, and young James to the sea, the letter from Jake Morrison promising partnership in a high-class establishment, the journey west that ended in betrayal and abandonment. As she spoke, Ellie found herself revealing more than she'd intended. The quiet desperation of her days in St. Louis, the pitying glances from younger women, the gradual invisibility that seemed to descend upon her as her hair grayed and her figure thickened with age. Pete spat into the fire, the amber liquid sizzling on the hot coals. Morrison, eh? That sidewinder's been running that game for years. Preys on lonely women, takes their money, leaves them for dead. You ain't the first. His voice hardened, heard tell of at least 3 others, none turned up alive. But I might be the last to survive it, Ellie said grimly, a new resolve hardening within her. Maybe. Question is, what you gonna do now? Pete rose and poured coffee into 2 chipped enamel mugs, handing one to Ellie. The brew was strong enough to stand a spoon in, but the warmth and bitterness were welcome. Ellie had been asking herself the same thing. She had no money, no connections, and no way back east. But something had hardened in her during those days in the desert, a resolve forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival. The woman who had meekly accepted her fate for decades was gone, burned away by the Nevada sun. I'm gonna make that bastard pay, she said quietly, the profanity unfamiliar but satisfying on her tongue. Pete's weathered face cracked into the first smile she'd seen from him, revealing surprisingly good teeth for a frontier man. Now that's the spirit. But revenge is a luxury out here. First, you gotta survive. Deadwood Gulch was everything Pete had warned her about, and worse. The main street was a muddy thoroughfare lined with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. Buildings leaned drunkenly against one another, constructed hastily and with little regard for permanence. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Gunfights erupted over card games, claim disputes, and wounded pride. The law was whatever the man with the fastest draw said it was. The town's only church was a converted tent where a circuit preacher visited once a month, if the weather and Indian relations permitted. The cemetery on the hill overlooking the gulch grew weekly, populated by victims of violence, disease, and the harsh realities of frontier life. But Ellie had learned something in her 58 years: how to read people, how to spot weakness and strength, how to survive in a world that didn't value aging women. She convinced Pete to let her clean his cabin in exchange for shelter, then gradually expanded her services to other miners who lived like animals in their squalid shacks. Ain't right, a lady doing such work, grumbled old Tom, a prospector who'd struck a small vein of silver and now lived in relative luxury, a 2-room shack with glass windows. He watched uncomfortably as Ellie scrubbed years of accumulated grime from his floor. Ain't right, grown men living in filth neither, Ellie shot back, her arms deep in soapy water. You pay me fair, I'll make your place fit for human habitation. Or you can keep living like a hog in slop. Makes no difference to me. But they both knew it did make a difference, to her pride, to her survival. Word spread through the gulch like wildfire. The miners, starved for any touch of civilization, began hiring Ellie to cook, clean, and mend their clothes. She charged fair prices and worked harder than men half her age, rising before dawn and returning to Pete's cabin long after sunset. More importantly, she listened to their stories, their dreams, their fears about growing old alone in this harsh land. In a place where most women were either prostitutes or the rare, revered wives of successful men, Ellie carved out a unique position, respected for her work ethic and her discretion. Within 6 months, Ellie had saved enough to rent a small building on the edge of town, a former storage shed that she scrubbed from floor to ceiling before declaring it habitable. She hung out a simple sign, painted by Pete in careful letters: Cartwright's boarding house, clean beds, hot meals, no questions asked. The boarding house became a sanctuary in the chaos of Deadwood Gulch. Ellie's rules were simple: no guns inside, no fighting, and everyone paid their tab. She enforced these rules with a shotgun she'd learned to use under Pete's reluctant tutelage and a steely determination that impressed even the hardest men. Her first boarders were the more respectable miners, followed by traveling salesmen, grateful for a place where they wouldn't be robbed or murdered in their sleep. Pete watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're doing well for yourself," he observed one evening as he helped her repair a broken chair. "But Morrison's type, they don't like being bested, especially by a woman." Ellie's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. "I'm counting on it," she said softly. "Let him come." Jake Morrison rode back into town a year later, expecting to find his latest victim long dead. Instead, he found Eleanor Cartwright running the most successful boarding house in 3 counties, with a reputation for fairness that extended from the mining camps to the territorial capital. Her establishment now occupied a proper building on the main street, with a dining room that served the best meals in town, and rooms that, while simple, were clean and secure. Their confrontation came on a dusty Tuesday afternoon. Jake swaggered into her establishment, confident and cruel as ever. He'd aged little in the year since she'd seen him, still handsome in a predatory way, with brilliantined hair and a waxed mustache. His suit was expensive, his boots polished to a high shine. Well, the old bird survived after all. Come to thank me for the lesson in frontier life?" His voice carried across the dining room, where several miners were enjoying an early supper. Conversations halted as heads turned toward the newcomer. Ellie looked up from her ledger, her gray hair pinned back severely, her dress simple but clean. The frightened, desperate woman Jake had abandoned was gone, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. She'd been expecting this moment, preparing for it, dreaming of it during the long nights when memories of the desert still woke her in a cold sweat. "Mr. Morrison," she said calmly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence, "you're not welcome here." Jake's smile never faltered, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the first inkling that his usual game had taken an unexpected turn. "Now, Ellie, that's no way to treat an old friend. Maybe we can work something out. I hear you're doing real well for yourself." He leaned on the counter, invading her space with practiced ease. "The only thing we're working out," Ellie replied, reaching beneath the counter, "is how fast you can get out of my establishment before I introduce you to my friend here." The shotgun appeared with practiced ease, its twin barrels pointing steadily at Jake's chest. Around the room, conversations stopped entirely. Even in Deadwood Gulch, everyone knew Eleanor Cartwright's reputation with that gun. She'd once shot a hole in the ceiling to break up a fight, then calmly informed the brawlers they'd be paying for repairs. Jake's confidence evaporated like morning dew under the desert sun. "Now hold on. You held on to my money and left me to die," Ellie said, her voice never rising above conversational level. "I figure that makes us even, provided you never darken my doorway again." Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. Jake backed toward the door, his hand hovering near his pistol, but not quite daring to draw on a woman who'd earned the respect of every gunfighter in the territory. "This ain't over," he snarled, his handsome face contorted with rage. "Yes," Ellie said simply, "it is." Jake Morrison left Deadwood Gulch that afternoon and never returned. Some said he'd moved on to easier prey in California. Others claimed he'd met his end in a poker game gone wrong in Denver. The most satisfying rumor, which Ellie allowed herself to believe on particularly good days, was that he'd tried his scheme on the wrong woman in Cheyenne, the widow of a cavalry officer who'd put a bullet in him before he could relieve her of her savings. Eleanor Cartwright didn't much care either way. She'd found something more valuable than revenge in the harsh beauty of the frontier. She'd found herself. At 59, she was no longer the desperate woman who'd answered a stranger's letter seeking companionship. She was a businesswoman, a pillar of the community, and proof that in the Wild West, survival mattered more than age, and grit counted for more than beauty. The desert that had nearly killed her had instead forged her into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. And on quiet evenings, when the day's work was done, she and Pete would sit on the porch of her boarding house, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Two survivors who had found in each other not romance, but something perhaps more precious: understanding and respect. "Never thought I'd live to see something like this," Pete remarked one such evening, gesturing at the thriving business Ellie had built. "Never thought I'd live at all, that day you found me," Ellie replied, her hand briefly covering his gnarled one. The desert stretched before them, beautiful and deadly as ever, but no longer something to fear. They had both learned its most important lesson: that sometimes what looks like an ending is merely the harsh beginning of something unexpected and remarkable.